Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 7th seminar of the Modern Money series. I'd like to thank everyone for being here, and I'd also like to thank our sponsors for this evening, which is the Columbia Business Law Association and the Columbia Law Student Democrats. And today, our mediator this evening will be Mr. Harvey Goldsmith, which is the Dwight Professor of Law at Columbia, and also former Commissioner of the SEC. And with that, I'll pass it off to him to introduce all of our speakers for this evening. So, thank you.
Thank you, and it's good to be here, and good for all of you to be here. And we're doing rent-seeking, instability, and fraud challenges the financial system. Clearly, would be that. This is part of a series of seminars that the students are running. The organization here of Workers' Rights Student Coalition. And so everything that goes right tonight belongs to the Student Coalition. Anything else, blame the rest of us up here. You'll notice a great deal about regulatory policy, innovation, et cetera, in the materials that advertise this. I have to tell one story, and then I'll let the real speakers go. It's a paraphrase of Paul Volcker on financial innovation, which is that the only financial innovation in the last 3 decades that was any good is the ATM machine. And I'm not sure that's wrong, although I think Paul does it partially with tongue-in-cheek.
Still in my quotes there.
Oh, I take it.
That's in my presentation.
All right, that one we...
It's a ribbon.
I'm going to introduce the speakers in alphabetical order. I'll tell only a little bit. They are quite distinguished, have terrific backgrounds, and we have biographical information about them, but I guess it wasn't distributed. But take as common ground, wisdom, expertise, thoughtfulness. This is really quite a good panel to hear. And what I'm going to do is introduce each panel member very briefly. He will then speak for 15 or 20 minutes. We'll have perhaps some dialogue among the panel members or a question from me. Then we'll go on to the next speaker. Our first speaker is Bill Black, whose line I just stole. Bill is Associate Professor of Law and Economics at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. He has a wonderful, active, full regulatory background, mainly from banking agencies. I told him I was going to note his book. It's one of the best titles I've come across. The Best Way to Rob a Bank is to Own It. Now, I think that goes back to the S&L crisis of the 1980s. But it may fit some of what's gone on since. With that much introduction, Bill, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much. Students, it's really impressive. I've seen the panels that you put together over the course of the academic year. And Rohan and everyone working on this is to be greatly complimented. Thank you, incredibly distinguished moderator, and then to it because time is short. So the title of this talk about the most reputable is a play off of a wonderful new study by a Columbia professor at the Graduate School of Business, Tomasz Piskorski, who is here, in which he makes the point empirically that the supposedly most reputable financial institutions in America, misrepresentation was pervasive, to quote the results of their study. Now, misrepresentation is the long version that economists use of fraud because there's a primitive tribal taboo among economists that keeps them from using the word fraud very often. But criminologists find it shorter. So I will be talking about those kinds of frauds and the fact that this study is one of the last nails in the coffin of the theory that this is the first virgin crisis. Conceived without any sin, no one did anything criminal, and it just produced the greatest disaster in economic history. So let me take you back in a time capsule to 1993, which turns out to be the great crossroads point. At that juncture, we had brought together the research, the data on what was going on in that savings and loan crisis, theory, the development of new theories about the nature of the frauds, praxis, in other words, practical things that we undertook to contain that crisis, and it was all multidisciplinary, and it was the end of dogma. Indeed, the head of our agency had to give up dogmas of a lifetime to come to this result, and became the great re-regulator and such. And we did it in the scientific fashion, God forbid, where the regulators autopsied every failure to look at what was going on. And in business school terms, we listened to the people closest to the facts. We listened to the field examiners, and we believed them when they told us that what they were finding was fraud emanating from the C-suite. This led to George Akerlof and Paul Romer's famous 1993 study, the development of theory. George Akerlof is the Nobel laureate in 2001, and he's writing in connection and an expansion of his work on Lemon's markets, which is his most famous work. So in his wheelhouse, criminologists, it's virtually never does the National Institute of Justice fund research into elite white-collar crime. God forbid they actually did in the savings and loan crisis. And the criminologists came together with their studies in 1993. The inevitable National Commission to investigate the causes, 1993, does its report. Department of Justice, the FBI, these are, SARS is the jargon for criminal referrals, through what in business school would be called a continuous improvement process. They become superb. The agency does more than 30,000 criminal referrals, produces over 1,000 felony convictions just in elite cases designated as major, and that greatly understates the degree of prioritization, because we worked with the FBI and the Justice Department to create the top 100 list, the 300 worst fraud schemes involving roughly 300 institutions and roughly 600 individuals, and had a 90% conviction rate against those folks, the greatest success against elite white-collar criminals. And so it seemed that we were poised in 1993 to really take these things on. Well, what did we develop? We developed the concept and an understanding of the damage of what control frauds did. We developed an understanding of how the control frauds operated when they used accounting as their weapon of choice. We understood how adverse selection produced a negative expected value in the lending process from the day the loans were made, not simply in retrospect. We understood how these perverse incentives were created that produced these epidemics of control fraud, what we call the 3 Ds: deregulation, desupervision, and de facto decriminalization. But we also saw the role that executive compensation, opaque assets that had no readily verifiable asset market values, and easy entry in the field did in terms of producing this kind of dynamic. We learned, in particular, I'll discuss what aggression's dynamic was and how it operates. The short answer is that it's bad ethics drives good ethics out of the marketplace. In these circumstances, markets become perverse. And we learned how the CEOs running these frauds were able to suborn the supposed controls and deliberately set off echo fraud epidemics in other professions and field. And we saw how the industry tried to produce a regulatory race to the bottom to destroy effective regulation. So what is this control fraud stuff? That's when a seemingly legitimate entity, governmental sector, private sector, or nonprofits, is used by those who control it as a weapon to defraud others. And that seeming legitimacy is an important part of the problem that makes us complacent and allows them to cause greatly increased damage. And it plays off of the reputable language in the study that I was talking about. There are various varieties of these fraud in the private sector. I'm going to concentrate when they use accounting as their weapon, and the primary direct victims are creditors and shareholders. In finance, the weapon of choice is accounting. So what did we learn overall? That these control frauds were causing greater financial losses than all other forms of property crimes combined. And in subsequent research from that time, we also learned that these are the frauds that maim and kill tens of thousands of people. And we learned why the CEO, when he or she is the crook, poses such a unique danger. First, they are able to suborn all the controls because those controls ultimately report to the CEO. Second, they're able to optimize the entity for fraud. Third, they're able to do all of this by using seemingly normal corporate mechanisms, which makes prosecution much more difficult when they use those means to loot. And four, the most audacious actually shape the external environment to create even more perverse incentives through creating these Gresham's dynamics. Key thing that Akerlof and Romer emphasized was emphasized by the regulators, by the National Commission, by the criminologists as well. And that is fraud is a sure thing, mathematically guaranteed if you use these accounting processes. So here is the recipe for accounting fraud for a lender or a purchaser in the field such as we're examining now in the current crisis. It has four ingredients. One, grow massively. This is, if possible, 50% annually. Second, by making or purchasing really, really crappy loans. Three, while employing extreme leverage. And four, while setting aside only trivial reserves for the inevitable catastrophic losses. In accounting jargon, this is the all provision. And there are actually three sure things that this recipe produces. First, it is a sure thing in the near term that the firm will report record income. Second, is a sure thing in modern life that with modern executive bonuses, the controlling officers will be made wealthy, and they will be made wealthy promptly. And third, this recipe, if you think through the four ingredients again, is ideal for maximizing real economic losses. In addition to these sure things, there's another thing that frequently happens, and that is this is a superb recipe for hyperinflating bubbles. Because after all, what do you do under this recipe when you're faced with overcapacity and a glut? You lend like crazy, even into the teeth of the glut. So it's optimal for hyperinflating bubbles. The saying in the trade is a rolling loan gathers no loss. What that means is as long as we can get the bubble to inflate, we can simply refinance the loan and we can dramatically defer loss recognition. Not losses, but loss recognition. And third, it is these massive bubbles, as we've seen, that are really weapons of mass destruction. So here is what Akerlof and Romer chose to conclude their famous 1993 article with for emphasis. Neither the public nor economists foresaw that savings and loan deregulation was bound to produce looting. Notice how powerful a statement they make without, weasel words. Nor, unaware of the concept, could they have known how serious it would be. Thus, the regulators in the field who understood what was happening from the beginning found lukewarm support at best for their cause. Now we know better. If we learn from experience, history need not repeat itself. Well, of course, we didn't know better. We as a species knew better, but in fact, if you will look at work on this crisis, even work discussing fraud in this crisis, you will see that virtually never are Akerlof and Romer cited. Nor is Akerlof 1970 on Lemon's Market cited, even though it's an article about control fraud in large part. Right? Even the fact that it's about control fraud is something that economists would be amazed about. This is the line where they said, the passage where they talked about the sure thing. many economists still seem not to understand that a combination of circumstances in the 1980s made it easy to loot a financial institution with little risk of prosecution. Once this is clear, it becomes obvious that high-risk strategies that would pay off only in some states of the world were only for the timid. Hint, moral hazard is what he's talking about. Why abuse the system to pursue a gamble that might pay off when you can exploit a sure thing with little risk of prosecution? And they go on empirically to estimate the role of fraud in a series of crises. Akerlof is also the person who first, in the economics literature, talked about the Gresham's dynamic in this context, where he said, dishonest dealings tend to drive honest dealings out of the market. The cost of dishonesty, therefore, lies not only in the amount by which the purchaser is cheated, the cost also must include the loss incurred from driving legitimate business out of existence. Now, Akerlof is a really smart guy, but there were smart people before him, and there's this guy named Jonathan Swift who put it this way: the Lilliputians look upon fraud as a greater crime than theft. For, they allege, care and vigilance, with a very common understanding, can protect a man's goods from thieves. But honesty hath no fence against superior cunning. Where fraud is permitted or connived at, or hath no law to punish it, or I would say no regulatory cops in the beat to enforce it, the honest dealer is always undone, and the knave gets the advantage. So this has been understood long before economists began looking at the subject. Now I'm going to skip through a number of these things about how wonderful we were. I will point this one out. This was the, don't bother to try distinguishing them because there was no difference. So the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission that looked into this causes of this crisis concludes widespread failures in financial regulation and supervision proves devastating to the stability of the nation's financial markets. The sentries were not at their post due to the widely accepted faith in the self-correcting nature of markets and the ability of financial institutions to effectively police themselves. I haven't gone through it, but we have a long explanation in criminology about why private market discipline doesn't simply fail, that it's actually oxymoronic, that creditors actually fund the frauds as opposed to disciplining the frauds, right? So most of the losses are suffered by the creditors, not the shareholders in these circumstances. And why regulators are therefore unique, because we are the only control that the CEO cannot hire and fire. That doesn't mean we're immune. There's a vast literature and attempts to influence us, but potentially we bring a unique strength because of that. Now we get to the study by your colleague, which, as I said, has driven the nail, a final nail into the coffin of any claim that there really couldn't have been fraud by financial institutions. So they went through and created two measures of misrepresentation of asset quality: misreported occupancy status of borrower and misreported second liens, by comparing the characteristic of mortgage disclosed to the investors. Now, the investors are the folks who are buying these loans and they're packaging them to create mortgage-backed securities, more specifically private label, in other words, not Fannie and Freddie. All right, with actual characteristics that were available at the time through a data set matched by a credit bureau. About 1 out of every 10 loans has one of these misrepresentations. Now, that's extraordinary, right? To have fraud roughly 1/10 of the time in the sale of mortgage loans, it guarantees a national crisis, right to be there. But the authors recognize that they are forced, by the nature of data, to some extent in the old joke, to look under the lamppost, right? You can look at some things using data, but you can't look at the broader frauds in the same, using the same mechanism. So they recognize quite appropriately that other literature has established there is vastly more fraud than this in some other categories. Our work concentrates on liar's loans, for example, in criminology in this. But just in these two areas, the extent of fraud was sufficient that it was going to cause a national crisis. And this is figuratively, this is the 1/10 of the iceberg, not the 9/10 of the iceberg. And they note that a lot of this fraud, half of what they studied in some sense, and that is the second liens, occurred at the institution levels because it's the same lender that made the first lien and the second lien. So obviously they knew about the second lien. But then when they sold the loan packages, they said, no, there's no second lien on these, there's only a first lien, right? That's a fraud that must come from the lender. That's a control fraud in our jargon. They can't answer the question with their methodology. It's not a criticism, it's just the nature of the beast, as to the disclosures about whether the borrower intended to occupy. Though that falsification could have come from the borrower, it could have come from the loan broker, it could have come from the loan officers, it could have come from all of them combined working together, right? And the study shows that the lenders were frequently aware of the risks. They were assuredly aware of the risk in the context of the seconds, but their pricing indicates that they were at least somewhat aware of the risk in the case of the owner-occupied misrepresentations. Here's the key one of the two key takeaways in the limited time that I have that I'll emphasize. A significant degree of misrepresentation exists across all reputable intermediaries involved in the sale of the mortgages. The emphasis is in the original. And at other points, they call it the most reputable financial institutions in America, which I would agree with, and that makes our point about seemingly legitimate entities. That is the point. That is the point that Lanny Brewer, the head of the criminal division, and Holder simply do not get. That people who wear nice suits and sit in the CEO's office can be and are criminals. That what we are describing are pervasively fraudulent institutions, and they are supposedly most reputable. That should be immensely scary. This is an incredibly powerful and important study. And it could have big bucks effects just in these two categories to the tune of repurchase of 160 billion. That doesn't mean losses, but that losses could be a very significant portion of this. All right. I want to get to this one as well. These misrepresentations are not instances of the classic asymmetric information problem in which the buyers know less than the sellers. Rather, we contend that they are instances where in the process of contractual disclosure by the sellers, buyers received false information on the characteristics of assets. Now, I have added the emphasis to the word classic. And this I would disagree with, right? I agree that this is classically how Akerlof is taught in economics and in B schools, but that is not what Akerlof's study shows. Akerlof's study shows classically that one of the best ways to maximize the asymmetry of information is to lie, but to lie through deceit, which is what fraud is all about. So this is, in fact, when we study in criminology, an absolute classic mechanism. It's just not taught that way in other schools. Who have never heard of, well, maybe they've heard of criminology, but I'm sure they've never read any of our stuff. And I'll end with this point. There's a neat little touch here. A loan with misrepresented borrower's occupancy status has about a 9.4% higher chance of default compared with loans with similar characteristics and where the property was truthfully reported as being the primary residence of the borrower. Okay, so let me put that in plain English. I'm not suggesting they weren't being plain, but this isn't a specialist audience. What the authors are saying is this. It's important whether a borrower is going to occupy the home. Borrowers where it's your primary dwelling, the cost of losing it is you and your family are thrown out on the street often. It's a big deal, and therefore you rarely will default if you have any alternative if on an owner-occupied dwelling, right? So institutions, lenders, charge people who are not going to be occupants significantly more. It's not in this study, but usually somewhere in the range of 100 basis points or more, right? So they looked and they said, okay, we're looking at a group that actually aren't occupying the home. And we're going to compare them in their defaults to a group that also isn't occupying the home. So these are both real estate speculators in common parlance. But they're not the same. The group that lies poses a substantially increased risk of default, which of course is telling us exactly what lending has told us for centuries and criminology has told us. And that is the people who lie and are the movants, who are the ones who are taking the lead in lying, are a vastly greater risk. Now what's really interesting is they do the same type of thing about the second liens. And they find very little difference in these two categories. And that suggests strongly that it was the institutions as opposed to borrowers who are putting the lies in liars' loans about second liens. So, to sum it all up, we unfortunately didn't know better. We utterly ignored the possibility of fraud. We created the most criminogenic environment in history, and we produced endemic fraud in our most reputable institutions that drove this financial crisis and hyperinflated the bubble. I don't have time to present it, but there was massive fraud in other areas, in particular in liars' loans. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill. I do want to come back and discuss, but maybe we'll go on a little bit. But the 1980s, the S&L crisis, the Sarbanes-Oxley period, WorldCom, Enron, Lynn and I learned to work with, and now the recent 2007, 8, 9 financial crisis have various things in common. Certainly one of them you correctly point out is the deregulatory push and foolish deregulation. Another would be the lack of anyone looking over people's shoulder. But there are differences too that are quite substantial. The S&L, if I remember it correctly, and I'm no expert, it was easy to loot. And it was particularly easy to loot because you had government guarantees of loans. So you were building up your cash hoard at a point where there was withdrawn oversight. And there was certainly venal fraud during that period. People went to prison. In the Sarbanes-Oxley period, the WorldCom, Enron, again, we had prosecution with hardcore things. When we sent the CEO of Enron and the CEO of WorldCom to prison, or a whole bunches of others, we had self-dealing and venal acts. Do you think the acts this time are the same, and why haven't we had more prosecution this time around?
Okay, so the short but not short answer to all of this is, first, while we know most people don't understand that we have nearly 1 million, getting feedback?
Okay, I'll turn this over.
We have nearly 1 million people in the criminal justice system, not the people in prison, the people working in it. And of those, roughly, on a really good day, roughly 2,500 do elite white-collar crime investigations. And most days are not good days. We have slightly over 1,300 industries in the United States. So there are fewer than 2 FBI agents per industry. One, they obviously don't have expertise in the industry. 2, they obviously don't patrol a beat. So they only come when there's a criminal referral. And criminal referrals, here's a hint, Enron never filed a criminal referral on its leadership. And no bank or savings and loan does either. So the regulatory agencies, and that includes the SEC in this context, are absolutely essential. In the savings and loan crisis, the head of the agency made it a top agency priority to A, target the frauds and drive them out of business through receivership, and B, to bring enforcement in criminal prosecutions. The agency made over 30,000 criminal referrals to do that. In the current crisis, the same agency, the Office of Thrift Supervision, which was supposed to regulate Countrywide, WAMU, IndyMac, a whole host of, whole host of them, made 0 criminal referrals. So the fundamental answer is they got no referrals. They never did what would have been considered, we would have used the word investigation to describe, of a single major player in the current crisis. And so our mantra in elite white-collar criminology is, if you don't look, you don't find. And they didn't look.
And they were very slow in getting off the ground, which is a difference between Enron, WorldCom, and this period. But it's time to get Mike up. Mike Norman is chief economist. Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Mike.
Lynn,
Go ahead. I'd like to hear you first.
No, I'm going alphabetically. Norman comes before Turner, I know that.
It's an updated, I think, the updated bio. I could do my bio off of here.
He's chief economist at John
I'm
Thomas.
no longer there, though.
No longer there?
No.
He was a great chief economist.
I'm still,
Go ahead, Mike.
I'll have it. How do I work this thing? Just this button. All right, good evening. I'll start. I want to thank Rohan for inviting me here. I got an email, I think it was back in September, out of the clear blue, somebody inviting me to speak at Columbia Law School. I was flabbergasted, to say the least. Very flattered. I wasn't sure how he found me. I think it was through my blog, and I think the connection with most of the speakers that have been in this series is the modern monetary theory. You know, Bill, teaching at UMKC, you've had people like Warren Mosler here, Stephanie Kelton, Randy Ray, Scott Fulwild. I think you know a lot of these people. And actually, I met, you know Warren Mosler? Any of you? I met him, I guess it's about 11 years now, in 2002. And just a little bit on my background, I have a degree in economics. I went to Penn undergrad. I went to UCLA to do graduate school in the late 70s. I didn't start out to do economics. I just kind of decided, after Penn, I decided to go out to California because I wanted to surf. And I got into UCLA easily. People were like, why are you leaving Penn to go to UCLA? And back then, it wasn't a highly rated academic school. It was a jock school. I just felt like going out to California. And actually, I wanted to get into the movies. I wanted to get into Hollywood. And I started to do some small films. I was in a couple of small films. And I was thinking, wow, life is great. And I had this little Italian sports car convertible. And one day I'm just sitting at a stoplight. It's a red light. Life is beautiful. I'm getting my start in Hollywood. And all of a sudden I hear a screech and a crash. And this car in the opposing lane, who was going to make a left turn, got rear-ended, sent this car careening into me broadside. I mean, my car was totaled. It's a miracle that I got out of that thing alive. And that was it. I mean, I was stuck in LA. I was a broke student. I had no money. I had no car, which if you're in LA without a car, that's death, even today, right? And I was like, now what am I going to do? My Hollywood dreams are dashed. So I thought, well, I guess I'll just go back to New York, and I guess I'll go work on Wall Street. And who knows, you know, so we never know the end of that, what the end of that story might have been. But you know what's funny? I always tell people, and I tell this to my kids and people that I meet, we always try to control every little detail of our lives, right? Like micromanage. But then something could come out of nowhere and completely change the course of your life, and you have no control over that whatsoever. You just have to go with it. So here I am today before you, the movie star that may have been, but the economist who is right now, modern monetary theory. So anyway, my background last 34 years on Wall Street. Started basically at Merrill Lynch. I'm a former member and trader on 4 different exchanges, futures exchanges, New York Futures Exchange, and NYMEX, COMEX, and Chicago Mercantile Exchange. I managed some money for Paul Tudor Jones for a while and Tudor Investment Corporation. I was a proprietary trader for Credit Suisse and Swiss Bank Corporation before Swiss Bank Corporation was bought by UBS. I lived in Switzerland actually for 10 years. I'm an economist, as I mentioned, activist, and seeker of the truth. Yes, yes. We're here today. This whole series, right, is, I changed the title a little bit. It's Modern Money and the Public Purpose, but I'm going to be talking mostly about my view from Wall Street as a trader for the last 34 years. So I called it Markets and the Public Purpose. And, you know, I got a little philosophical here because we have former regulators with us, great guys. And by the way, when Rohan told me that, you know, I was invited to come here and he said Bill Black was on the panel, I thought I had to debate Bill Black. And I was like, no way, man, I'm not doing that. Not because I thought I'd do a bad job. I think I could have done a good job, but Bill Black, he's the man. I agree with everything he says. I didn't want to debate him, so I was almost ready to bow out of this thing. But like I said, we have regulators here, and I got a little bit philosophical here. You know, it's always good to take an idea to its logical extreme, right? Because you hear a lot, especially nowadays, oh, regulation, it's killing the economy. And, you know, we're here trying to say that it was the relaxation or the stripping away of regulation that got us into this mess. And we have guys like Bill Black, you know, showing us that this is what happened. That is the truth. But there's a whole belief system out there that it was the regulators that are the problem. And we're regulating too much now, and we have to have this kind of very laissez-faire. And, you know, the most popular book out there now is what? You know, Atlas Shrugged, Fountainhead, Ayn Rand, right? How many of you are fans? Right? Good, good. So you take an idea and you take it to its logical extreme. Like, let's not have any regulation. Let's not have any government at all. Every man for himself. So that's why I'm a big fan of Thomas Hobbes, 16th century English philosopher, where he wrote in his seminal work, Leviathan, life without government would be a jungle state. In that state, each person would have a right or a license to everything, like these criminals in the banks, right? That's what they believe. That's what's happening, right? It's a jungle state. Hobbes argued that would lead to a war against all. And in such a state, people fear death and lack both the things necessary for a good life and the hope of being able to toil to obtain them. So in order to avoid it, what happens? People come together and they establish a social contract, a civil society. And to these people who preach Ayn Rand, I ask them all the time, show me one example, give me one example of a state or a nation that exists where everybody just does whatever they want. Okay? I mean, I'm a pretty big guy. I could go out there and take from a lot of people if I wanted to, and you don't have to be big. You could use a weapon, you could use a gun, right? But people, human beings, we don't want to live in a jungle state. So this is the great contradiction I find among these people who go out there and say, we don't need regulation. Regulation is ruining everything. The government is ruining everything. So show me an example where that doesn't exist, where life is wonderful. I'll show you where it is. It is in the jungle, in the animal world. And you know something? Even in the animal world, there are societal structures that exist. It's not all just craziness, do whatever you want. So that's a lie, okay? That itself is a fraud, and it's ignorance. It's people speaking from pure ignorance. And look, our own Constitution, right? We forget about this a lot, the preamble to our own Constitution, because, you know, we hear people say, well, it's unconstitutional, and the government's getting involved where it shouldn't get involved, and we shouldn't be spending money, and that's unconstitutional, and we're broke, and this and that. But here it is. The framers wrote this down. This is their very words. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice. We have a Justice Department. We have a justice system, as flawed as it is, okay? Ensure domestic tranquility. We have law enforcement, as bad as that is. Provide for the common defense, and boy, do we know that. And it's not even defense anymore. It's provide for the common war. We spend trillions of dollars on that. Promote the general welfare. There it is. What's the general welfare? Creating a society where people have a state of well-being, where they can achieve the things that they want to achieve. That's one of the basic things in the framing of the Constitution. It's right in there. We forget about that part, and I'm not a legal scholar, but I think this has been used as an argument in courts of law, and it has been like kind of thrown out. You can't use that for some reason, but there it is in the Constitution. I'm always amazed at that. Like, we can't spend money as a government to ensure that kids aren't starving and that people have a decent place to live and that our roads and our bridges and our infrastructure are okay and intact, and that we have, you know, we live in this country of unbelievable abundance, and we always talk as if there is lack. There's not lack. There's abundance. There it is. We ignore it. Okay? Promote the general welfare. Here's my friend Warren Moser. I'm going to use his quote, start off with my talk about the financial sector, where he says the financial sector is a lot more trouble than it's worth. And boy, let me tell you something, truer words were never spoken. And Harvey, there is Paul Volcker, not quite exactly the one that you used, but this was from a talk he gave at the Economic Club of New York. I think it was back in 2008, where he said, you know, and this is Paul Volcker, the god of gods of central bankers, right? I have found very little evidence that vast amounts of innovation in financial markets in recent years have had a visible effect on the productivity of the economy. Maybe you could show me that I'm wrong. All I know is that the economy was rising very nicely in the 1950s and 60s without all these innovations. Indeed, it was quite good in the 1980s without credit default swaps and without securitization and without CDOs. And let me show you something, folks. Take a look at this chart, and I'm just going to come around here because I want to show you. This is a chart of GDP, our real gross domestic product, going back to 1950. And this is year-over-year percent change. We had some dips, okay, in the 50s and the 60s, but look at the peaks. All the peaks were higher. And once you got into the 1980s, when this whole, you know, doctrine of deregulation started, look at what happened. We collapsed. Look at what happened with the exponential growth of the financial industry that coincided exactly with that point in time. Collapsed, okay? The explosion in the growth of the size of what benefit did we get? The growth fell off a cliff. And it's still falling off a cliff. So he's absolutely right, Volcker, when he said that. He's show me the only thing it did is increase the risk in the system. That's it. And enriched people who were involved in this business, which is basically a casino-type economy. All right? Look at this. In 1972, when the United States population was 200 million people, we built 2.6 million homes. And back then, the banks would issue the mortgage, they would hold the mortgage, they would service the mortgage. It was a plain vanilla bank. The only thing the banks did back then in 1972 was lend people money. That's it. They didn't do derivatives, they didn't have prop desk trading or anything. we built 2.6 million homes. In 2006, at the height of the real estate bubble, when the US population was 300 million, we added 100 million people, what happened? We built 2.6 million homes. What changed? Exactly the same. I'll tell you what changed. The financial sector had become unwieldy. A massive amount of intermediation was involved. It was no longer the bank making a mortgage to you. It was the bank making a mortgage to somebody, then that was sold to somebody else, and that was sold to somebody else, and then that thing was used as collateral for some other crazy thing. And at least if you said everybody in America had a house and they had a job and they, you know, the general the promoting of the general welfare was taken care of, at least you could say it was worth it. But was it worth it? There's no way you could say it was worth it. The amount of productivity was exactly the same. However, we injected an enormous amount of risk. And we're going through the unwinding of that risk right now. And it's literally killing millions of people, including kids. In 2007, 40% of all corporate profits went to the financial sector. 40%, that's it. That's an amazing, crazy number. For doing what? For basically redistributing the money in the economy. That's all it does. That's all Wall Street does. Does it build a road? Does it police your street? Does it put out fires? Does it educate your kids? Does it build a bridge? Does it create water and sewer system? It just moves the money around in the economy. And 40% of our gross domestic product went to that. Now you have to think, especially now again, when we hear all these complaints from people about the government and all they do is just redistribution. And they're taxing, which they're not, okay? But they say it. It's always a phony argument, but they say it's redistribution and it's not fair. Is this fair? This is the largest redistribution, and this is the vaunted, you know, we can't attack this, right? I mean, we can, the three of us, the four of us, but nobody pays attention. But you can't attack it. Why? Because it's the vaunted capitalistic system. It's the private sector. You gotta leave it alone because it knows what to do, okay? And the government is bad and it's terrible and it's horrible. But this is the capitalism at work. The private sector, you gotta leave it alone. It knows what to do. It knows what to do. Boy, it sure did, right? I mean, look at what it did. The U.S. has the large, again, okay, what did we get out of it? Like, let's go back to that chart up there. What did we get out of it? Maybe you're right, maybe I'm wrong. Look, I'm all about truth, as I said. I'm like, my thing is honesty. I hate labels, all right? People say to me, oh, you know, you're a Democrat, you're a Republican, you're a socialist, you're this, you're that. I hate labels. Labels are stupid, okay? It's for people who can't think. They have to compartmentalize everything into like a word, right? If you could show me that all this was good and we came out of it somehow with some great results, I'll embrace it, man. You know, when I met Warren Mosler, there's a funny story. I don't want to take up too much time. I know, you know, we're under a time constraint here. I was invited to go to a Bloomberg seminar where Warren Mosler was speaking. And at that point, see, because I learned economics from all the wrong, and it's still wrong, okay? Academic economics is it has no relevance. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. But still, I learned it back in the 70s, and it was already ridiculous then. But I remember up at that point and you know, I spent 10 years as a Fox News contributor, and then Fox Business, and you know, I used to spout all this stuff like we're broke and we're out of money and the dollar's going to collapse and who's going to lend us money, that, you know, all this wrong stuff. I was like, I had that in me. And I met Warren Mosler, and you know, he's the most polite, patient guy. He's such a sweet guy. And I'm in this room and I got up, he's talking about, you know, imports are a benefit, exports are a cost, you know, all this stuff like that. And we could, And I'm like, what are you, crazy? I got up. You don't know what you're talking about. I was rude to the guy. And he's such a nice guy. And he was patient. He was trying to show me. And but I went out of that seminar. And I went home. And something, it was like, like a seed was planted in my head. And I started to think about all these things. And I'm like, wait a minute. I had it all wrong the whole time. This guy, he enlightened me. And you know what Warren said? We became great, great friends. We talk almost on a daily basis. He said, once you learn that, Mike, your life will be miserable from now on. And he was absolutely right. And I blame him for that. Because it is miserable. Because every day I go through these fights with people, trying to show them, like, that's not reality, dude, what you're thinking there. This is the reality. You try to show them, but they're so locked into their dogma. Anyway. Here we go, Wall Street, okay? The vaunted Wall Street. And I have a personal story, by the way, I'll just run through this. Goldman Sachs, right? Remember the whole subprime fiasco. Goldman Sachs admits to fraud. They're like, yeah, we did it. Bill's talking about stuff like the guys hide it, right? And, smart guys like Bill, they see it, they point it out. Other people maybe, Goldman Sachs didn't even hide it. It's like, yeah, we did it, so what? And they get a little fine, right, for that. I think they paid $800 million for a trade. They made billions on these trades, right? They create some security that was the Paulson trade, that John Paulson, this obscure money manager who was maybe managing like $100 million. Nobody ever heard of him for 40 years, okay? You had guys like George Soros and Tudor Jones, and Stanley Druckenmiller. These were like the A-list of the hedge fund guys, the superstars. Who knew about John Paulson? Then John Paulson goes to Goldman Sachs and he says, I want you to create a security for me, an instrument that has every single of the worst, shittiest, more loans and mortgages in there that you could pot, that they're going to blow up. And I want you to go out and sell that, and I'm going to bet against that thing. It was a short thing. It was totally rigged, right? And that's exactly what Goldman Sachs did. They created that instrument for him. Then they went overseas to Germany and these little Landesbanks and stuff like that. And they told these people it was great, AAA rated, right? The thing blew up. That's how he made his $20 billion. I'm running out of time. I'm going to tell you a little personal story.
5 more minutes and I don't have to go. So you're doing well. You're doing well. Don't stop now.
I'll end on a personal story. I worked for a short period of time, which was not included in my little bio there, at Standard & Poor's, okay? One of the enablers in this whole thing. In 2000, I worked at Standard & Poor's, and I was in their structured finance division. That's the division that rated all of this crappy garbage, this mortgage stuff. And I wrote a piece at the time about General Motors. General Motors stock in 2000 was trading at an all-time high of $80 a share. I wrote a negative analytical piece where I talked about these really way over-the-top rosy assumptions of GMAC, their financing unit, about how they were expecting to make all this money on leases and stuff like that. And to me, it seemed like the slightest little bump in the road, economically speaking, if the economy slowed down, because I'm an economist, I looked at it through that prism, this stuff is going to implode. So the chief auto analyst at S&P, this guy named Scott Sprinzen, he was furious at this thing that I wrote. And we got in this big argument, which eventually led to me being fired. I got fired, all right? I was allowed to resign, but let's call it what it was. It was a firing. Fast forward. General Motors goes bankrupt. The public has to bail it out, okay? I was fired. Scott Sprinzen is still over there at his post at Standard & Poor's, and a few years later, I was over at Fox News, and I met Terry McGraw, who is the chief CEO of McGraw-Hill, which owns S&P, and I told him about that story, and he was like, oh, gee, that's too bad, Mike. So anyway, I had a little bit more, but I'll leave it over to Lynn right now. Thank you very much.
Okay, I think we'll go right on to Lynn Turner. Lynn Turner, to give you a drop of background, is currently the principal at a forensic accounting firm. He's held all kinds of jobs, but most important by far, at least in my view, was as chief accountant at the SEC. We began the same day, I should tell you. I began as general counsel in 1998 as Lynn began. And he remains one of my favorite people, although he does drive you crazy at times.
Only at times?
Only at times. He is thoughtful. He is certainly one of the great figures in accounting in the United States and the world. He did practice for a long while with the predecessor to PwC, Coopers and Lybrand. He brings to everything a breadth of intelligence, analytical power, and a nice laugh. Get his laugh more. And with that, Lynn, you're on your own.
Thank you, Harvey. That's high praise coming from a person who I think was probably the greatest general counsel that the SEC ever had. I worked with a number of general counsels at the commission, but Harvey was just superb and someone who could always find a way to make it work. Other general counsel I worked with would always say, oh, this is the way we've done it at the SEC for 100 years, and we'll be doing it that way for the next 100 years, and they were right. Harvey came in, though, and Harvey was a breath of fresh air. And Harvey always found a way to make things work, so kudos to Harvey. Let me start out. This is a hard act to follow, but both these guys are just fantastic, but probably going to modify my presentation a little bit here. But let me start out by talking about a GAO study. And of course, the GAO is a nonpartisan congressional body. And this study came out just this last month, and it talked about what the impact of this thing is or has been on Americans. And it is truly stunning numbers what it has done to this country. Students in college well know the impact. Many have had a very difficult time getting jobs. They're back with mom and dad, thank goodness for mom and dad, but it's not where they prefer to be. So it's tough times, but $9.1 trillion, that was about the size of the entire stock market back at the time of the dot-com crash. The numbers are phenomenal. And for the first time since 1945, in all of America, the value of the homes was less than the value or the amount of debt that had been taken out to buy those homes. Not by a small amount, but by 3.7 trillion. We'd have to go back 67 years, 2/3 of a century, right coming out of World War II, as the soldiers came home and started to buy homes to find that same scenario. And we all know about the cost of unemployment, the cost of lost returns for those that are in retirement or about to hit retirement. International Monetary Fund has done some calculations that said the impact on the losses from the economy in general, the GDP, was 13 trillion. That puts this price tag at $22 trillion. And think about that in the context of if we shut down the U.S. economy, shut down Manhattan, shut down Wall Street, no one went to work, the banks shut down, there were no services provided, nothing was done, this country just ground to a halt. No manufacturing, no new cars, no nothing. It would take 1.5 years of that to equal the $22 trillion. That's the type of damage that was impacted on this country, and I find it absolutely phenomenal when people like Jamie Dimon go out there and say, let's have a cost-benefit analysis. You know, it's stupidity beyond belief. This is a short cost-benefit analysis. We don't want to see this happen again. The problem, though, is that no one views themselves as being accountable for this. And I think if you look at what transpired, one can start to understand that we all like to blame the bankers. And I'm the first to blame the bankers. I'd like a few scalps myself. I think there should have been some scalps, and probably more than a few. But unfortunately, that's not happened. Harvey had talked about, or asked Bill why there weren't prosecutions when I was at the commission the first time. As Bill Clinton was getting ready to leave office, the deputy attorney general at the time was a guy by the name of Eric Holder. And Eric, we got a proposal at the SEC that the White House would pardon Michael Milliken. We opposed it. The then director of enforcement, a great guy, wrote a letter to the White House saying we oppose it. We leaked it to the New York Times. And a story comes out and they come back. They still want to pardon Michael Milliken after what he had done. And then Arthur Levitt wrote a fine letter to the White House opposing it. And we leaked it to the New York Times. And that one didn't go through. But Holder was the one reviewing these, and the next one was Mark Rich. And Holder approved the pardon of Mark Rich. On this time, though, they didn't call us. They didn't ask us. They just went and did it. Now, if you've got an attorney general who believes it's fine to go give those guys a pass, in essence with the opportunity to raise money then for the Clinton Library, is there any question as to why you're not getting prosecutions? If you've got that type of mentality at the top of that agency, and keep in mind the number 3 attorney at the Department of Justice was the monitor at AIG who was put in place after the Spitzer Accord and was supposed to be overseeing this organization, seeing that it was working and was controlled and was functioning right. And we all know that was a miserable failure. If you had gone after AIG, it would have had implications for the number 3 guy at DOJ. And in fact, the person inside AIG who blows the whistle on it initially, writes a letter that goes all the way up to the board, had worked with the Eastern District, and the Eastern District had decided to indict when the DOJ said we want to review all the files in Washington, D.C. And then DOJ in Washington, D.C. opposed doing indictments and bringing anyone to trial. So we aren't going to have prosecutions. We've now gone past statute on limitations on most of these cases anyway. So unfortunately, despite $22 trillion in destruction to Americans across the board, our Department of Justice thought it wasn't enough to bring these people to trial. There were a lot of causes, heard some of those already. I think in general, when I look at these, you can put them typically into 3 buckets. One was the lack of transparency. We didn't always have, on a broad basis, a clear picture of the quality of loans that the banks were doing. There was some of that out there, but not as broad as it should have been. There was not a clear transparency of the lack of conflicts, the lack of independence of places like Standard & Poor's and the credit rating agencies, or at the banking agencies. And there certainly was a lack of accountability because no one was getting taken to task for what they were doing. And perhaps much along the lines of what we just heard, everyone got lost in this notion of the greater buck and forgot about the greater good. And I would say many people in America did that. When you talk about all these mortgage loans, the real estate agents that were selling the homes, the loan originators that knew what they were doing with these bad loans. These are next door neighbor type people. These are people on the street. These aren't the Rubens, the Chuck Princes, and they all knew exactly what they were doing. We were like in a drunken stupor, if you will. And what I found over the years, dealing as a regulator and dealing with the markets, is you're talking about putting people together with gargantuan sums of money. And when you take a person and put them out there with a pile of gold around them, they're going to act differently. There is a reason we build a fence and big tall walls around Fort Knox. And when you have a capital market, you have more money floating around than what you have at Fort Knox. And if you haven't built the fences, people will be people and will walk out the door with that money. And so you have to build a regulatory scheme that regulates people. And you often hear, Harvey and I would often hear at the commission, oh, we don't want to regulate people's behavior. But that's what the markets are all about. And only if you can have fair and orderly markets brought by a fair amount of regulation. Thoughtful regulation, though. There's a difference between regulation just for the sake of regulation and thoughtful regulation. But only if you have protections that ensure a high degree of transparency, a high degree of accountability, and you've taken care of the independence, made sure that there aren't conflicts, and what conflicts do exist are made readily transparent to everyone. That's the only time you can have a market work. And today, people are nervous about the markets. People are not investing today in the markets like they should, and it's slowing us down. So why did it happen? Obviously, we had the bankers. They were incented for volume, not quality. Everyone was out doing it. Your next door neighbor who is the mortgage originator, the real estate lender. No one had skin in the game. It was all about making money. It was not only a runaway train, it was a bad movie. This was, the country in general was in suspended disbelief. And I remember there's a Business Week article back in around 2006. I went back through my stack of Business Weeks and this whole thing blew up. And sure enough, there is an outstanding article before it all blows up that talks about, in full public view, about the fact we're building homes at a faster rate than we've ever built before, that it's the rate of homes that we're building is far outstripping demand, and we're building up a tremendous excess inventory. I mean, it's not like it wasn't known. People saw it, regulators ignored it, investors ignored it, and when no one had skin in the game and thought no one would get caught but could continue to get phenomenal fees, that real estate agent closed more houses, they made more. If you were an originator, more originations, more. If you were a banker and you could package these and sell them, you made more. And it's just the way people behave. And if you don't have regulations that slow down the train, it always happens. I've been around to see the corporate M&A scandals of the late 60s, early 70s, like Penn Central, that Harvey will remember well. The S&Ls that Bill Black talked about. I was at the SEC for the dot-coms, and now this one. And every single one is the same characteristic of a large group of people getting carried away with excess compensation, and with regulators, no one putting on the brakes. In fact, in this case, though, it was even worse, because the state of North Carolina and other state AGs tried to put the brakes on, tried to stop some of the predatory lending, and the government's own Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, regulating 10,000 banks in this country, sued the state of North Carolina to prevent them from putting on the brakes on predatory lending. Our own government sued and actually won at the Supreme Court level, thereby enhancing the level of destructive damage done to the country. The SEC, as we all know, oversaw the 5 failed to oversee the 5 banks. In the Valukas report, they basically said the SEC was on site at Lehman but clueless, didn't even understand what was going on. CFTC didn't have the money, didn't have the staff. They were like someone going into a fight with a water gun. They were outgunned, outmatched, and didn't have the leadership, which they currently have, to get them there. And attorneys, we're talking about a law school. The attorneys wrote and drafted every single one of these agreements. The attorneys were facilitators. The attorneys, the legal profession, played a major, major role here. And we've seen the legal profession move from being in the business of justice to just being in the business of business these days. And so we've seen a serious degradation in the quality of ethics of the law firms and what law firms are willing or not willing to do. They have solely become advocates for whoever will turn around and pay them. A hired gun is probably the best description of the legal profession today. There are some that do good work, but it's certainly diminished from where it was. We talked about S&P, the auditors, my own profession. If you go back and look at the audit reports on BFA from 2007 through 2010, not a single word changes. It's the same report. And yet if you look at BFA, here's a bank that went through serious deterioration, serious problems, and the auditors told us nothing about it. Our own accounting standard setters, when Harvey and I were at the commission, we pressed hard to try to get them to require greater disclosures. In fact, they had undertaken a project to require greater disclosures, give us much better information about loans. And a few years after Harvey and I left, the banking regulators, the Fed and the OCC, quashed that project. So we didn't see the data that we could have seen to put brakes on some of this. And I remember, it's interesting, the due diligence was bad. I was back here with Morgan Stanley in a meeting, top people at Morgan Stanley, and they were talking about doing these underwritings, the commercial paper stuff, the money market loans, and they were talking about how they're getting calls from the companies at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and would fund a new offering yet that day. And I asked them, because I've gone through these episodes myself as an executive or as an auditor, and I said, I've actually worked on Wall Street, and I said, how can you do any due diligence? And then he said, we can't. We just can't do it. And I said, so why do you expose yourself to that risk? And they said, because Lynn, if we don't do it, the next guy will do it. And that became the mentality on Wall Street. So the notion of ethics on Wall Street is like an oxymoron. I mean, unbelievable. On the board of directors that oversaw these, in August of 2008, I was with the longest serving director on the board of Merrill Lynch. And by that point in time, Merrill Lynch was in serious trouble and within a month of being sold. So one of the largest investment banks in the world, in the US, phenomenal reputation. And we were talking, and I said, well, you know, guys are in kind of dire straits and all here and all. And this director, she turns to me and she says, you know, Lynn, I've thought about it and I've thought about it. Here's a director, it's been on the executive committee, been around at Merrill Lynch for over a dozen years, been the chair of the audit committee. And she turns around and she says, I've thought about it and I've thought about it, Lynn, but you know, Lynn, if I had to do it all over again, I found there's not a single thing I'd do differently. And I'm sitting here thinking, you're a director on a company this size, and it's gone belly up, and there's nothing you would do differently? I mean, and to have those type of people, or a person I greatly admire, a good person was on the executive committee of the board of AIG that same year, end of July, 1st of August, we're out on a rafting fishing trip, and I'd seen their disclosures. I've been reading them, of course, this before they blow up. They've got $60 billion in 3 real estate portfolios, and I just noticed that their most recent earnings release had just come out of AIG, and in black and white they said, we're not going to have $1 of loss in our real estate portfolios. A $60 billion portfolio. Now, $60 billion of real estate, that's a big portfolio. I don't think God could manage a $60 billion portfolio in real estate and not have a single dollar of loss. But here are these people, godlike people at AIG, and they're actually publicly saying we're not going to have a dollar loss, you know. And the director, I was concerned about him, and I pulled him to the side as we got out of the river, and I said, hey, you know, you guys got these disclosures. If you look at this, you guys, this ain't good. And there's 3 or 4 studies of you guys out on the street. It's doubtful that you guys are going to be able to sustain this. It looks like you're going to have some pretty sizable losses. And the director put his arm around me, kind of a fatherly way, and he says, Lynn, on the board of AIG, we've looked at this thoroughly. We've top to bottom, and I will guarantee you, Lynn, we're not going to have $1 loss. And you know, he was right. They didn't. They had over 100 billion of losses, you know, before it was all said and done. So clearly there was a problem there, but there's some more stories like that. I mean, it's just amazing to see. Congress got involved in investors. I think are at fault here too. You heard Michael talk about Goldman Sachs and the Abacus transaction. I've actually gone back and looked at it, and it was true. It was truly a rigged transaction, rigged by Goldman and rigged by Paulson. There's no question about that. But if you went back and actually read the offering memorandum, there were principally 3 large foreign institutions that went into that, the German bank and a couple others. But if you read that offering document, you would have to have been brain dead. I mean brain dead to invested in that. And any investor who had done their homework on that Abacus transaction couldn't have fulfilled any fiduciary responsibility to the people whose money they were managing when they made that investment. So while certainly Goldman and others who were involved structuring Paulson bear responsibility, the asset managers who put the money in there should have been taken to task as well. There's no question about it. We talked about the Financial Crisis Commission. Bill Michael talked about that. It's not just here. God, look at it around the world. Anytime you just put money together, make it easy for a lot of people to make money, it happens. So what do we got to do? We got to get Dodd-Frank implemented. Unfortunately, it's fantastic. People, the bankers especially, talk about all the costs of Dodd-Frank. Half of it's not even been put in place yet. And I'm amazed that it's costing them so much since they haven't had to do anything. You know, I'm wondering what they're spending money on. I think until we go back and reenact Glass-Steagall, I was on a panel with the chair of the audit committee at J.P. Morgan in the last 2 weeks. And I made this comment, and I was surprised that he actually agreed that the banks have gotten too big to manage, and eventually we're going to have to break up the banks. I said we probably have to do it in 10 to 20 years. He said it would probably be more likely in the next 5 to 7 years. Here's a former director of one of the Federal Reserve banks, and like I said, the chair of the audit committee at J.P. Morgan. So I'm not sure he and Jamie agree on that point. Yeah. Well, Jamie is Jamie. What can you say? You know, as I told the audience, I've got a little 18-month-old granddaughter. Just a great little lady. But every once in a while, when I spoil her, I'll give her back to mom and she whines. And I was talking about how, you know, she'll whine once in a while, but I got to tell you, I've never heard anyone whine like Jamie Dimon does. We do need, if we're going to fix things, we've got to get back to accountability. You've got to go find prosecutors and regulators. It's back to the Elizabeth Warren question. When are you going to take these banks to trial again? And until they do, we just will not get it. And unfortunately, one of the problems is every time the regulators do start to move, you get Congress jumps all over them or moves to cut their funding to prevent them from doing that. We need regulators that are independent of the banks. That's certainly not where we're at today. Harvey and I were both in a meeting with the Federal Reserve, actually with all the banking regulators at the time, and it was this issue about loan losses and making them more transparent and all. And we were just starting, and Alan Greenspan was down at the end of the table. Just shortly, within 5 minutes into the conversation, Alan turned to Arthur, Harvey, and me, who were all sitting there together, and Alan says, "What does it matter if you fudge the numbers a little? What does it matter if the banks fudge the numbers a little bit?" Well, I think we now know the answer to that question. You know, thank goodness we had Harvey there to respond, because he responded in a most professional manner. I would have responded differently, but anyway, we've got to get people at the Fed. And in the Dodd-Frank original proposal, there was a solution. In the draft of Dodd-Frank that was issued in November of 2009, they stripped all of the examination and supervisory responsibility out of the Fed, out of the OCC, and put it into a new agency that couldn't be captured. And that's what needs to be done. And unfortunately, the Fed and the banks launched a big lobbying effort with Chris Dodd and the rest of the banking committee, and that got taken out of the Dodd-Frank. Until we get that back in, you won't get things fixed. We've talked about improved transparency. We've got to get it to where the banks just have to disclose much more information about the credit quality. They've always opposed it. The Fed has opposed it. They always say there'll be a run on the bank if you put that information out there. We've gone through a number of banking crises now without that information out there, and it's not working. Sooner or later, someone's going to learn a lesson and realize by putting the information out there, you'll allow people to turn around and bring discipline to the market at an early enough time that it caused the bank to change. The largest bank in Colorado ever to fail failed in this crisis. It was bigger than Silverado, that got a lot of attention because of the Bush involvements during the S&L crisis. But in this bank, it turned out, the state regulator brought this out, that the federal banking regulators 4 or 5 years earlier had started writing examination reports saying that this bank was in trouble, making bad loans and requesting changes. Over a 4 to 5 year period, not a single change got made, not a single change in management got made, not a single change in directors got made, and then the bank failed. Those reports should have been made public all along. They wouldn't have caused a run on the bank. What was more likely is they would have caused the people at that bank to change what they were doing. That's what you got to do to regulate behavior here. And until we get that, you aren't going to have that. And the same thing needs to happen at the SEC, by the way. And finally, we've got to do something with Congress. Congress constantly beats the regulators to death. I always knew when someone was in town meeting with the congressional people, because I'd get a call from congressional staff, and then you'd see in the public filings about campaign contributions that someone opposing something had been there, and they'd call you up and waste your time, call you up and criticize you for doing something. And it's just not a healthy process. We've seen what's going on with the sequestration and the other things. Congress is a miserable failure, and it isn't helping things. But fixes, will it happen? Will it prevent the next one? No. We just don't have what we need to have in Washington at this point in time. So I suspect in the next dozen years or so, we'll get back on that train. The train will get going again, and kabam, we'll have another repeat.
Thank you, Lynn. I think we ought to open this up for questions. You've been such a patient and wonderful audience in many ways. Do keep in mind the theme running through Lynn's talk, which for me is the key issue over the next decade. Financial institutions, too big to fail, has been around the press and noted. Too big to manage and too big to regulate are things we've got to focus on and think about as to how we move forward in the next decade or so. With that, let me open it up for comments. Yeah,
Very happy to see. Is the mic on? Oh, the mic?
just press the buttons.
Press the.
Speak button, okay. Great combination of criminology and regulators, because my question is, one of my pet peeves at the moment is, why isn't Sarbanes-Oxley being enforced against Jamie Dimon? I mean, I would love to see, I think this is just such a beautiful case that could be brought against him that would be so astounding. So the question is, why isn't it? I mean, I know the answer to it, but
And I see your reason.
why
Go
isn't
ahead.
there a groundswell of former regulators and criminologists beating the table for that?
Let me see if I understand the question right. So they had the trading problem.
Right.
It turned out that they then restated their financial statements and had to announce that their internal controls were not adequate.
Exactly.
And Jamie Dimon and his CFO had previously certified that their internal controls were adequate. And Sarbanes-Oxley includes a provision that allows then the regulators and the DOJ to take action against executives who have falsely certified their controls.
Exactly.
The general counsel for Jamie Dimon is a very competent, very good attorney by the name of Stephen Cutler. Stephen was the former director of enforcement
Yes.
at the SEC.
Yes.
And you would never see the current people at the top of the SEC, as that was transpiring, go bring that action.
Yes, I understand that completely. But why aren't people screaming about it and making noise about that
Well,
and saying,
you
is it
gotta
just
ask yourself-
is it just hopeless to say, we accept the
But
fact that
he
hired the general
I think
counsel?
part of the problem here is the government in general moved very slowly as things broke in 2007 and 8 and 9 in developing cases. And that's opposed to the period, for instance, as WorldCom and Enron and the rest got into trouble, where the government actually moved very quickly or relatively quickly in developing cases. But there's got to be a basis. I mean, you can't just, putting it bluntly, think about scalps where things have gone wrong. You've got to ask yourself, is there a real liability here?
I think in that
Now-
case, absolutely there is.
Now, there may or may not, but it's often far more complex than it looks
I
on the
understand that.
outside. There's a-
Be careful, Harvey, you're getting out on the plank.
No, I'm not.
I think so.
There are things clearly they'd be looking at, including the change of the risk formula. But these things, when you're on the inside, where Lynn was when he was young, you do see how complex they can be. And then picking out any individual for liability can be even harder. A number of times as a commissioner, I said to the staff, I don't want to settle with an entity, I want a name. And I'd send them back. I wouldn't allow the commission to accept the settlement, and I had enough influence to do that. And they come back a few months later and without a name. But I knew it was hard to get those names, to be able to show that someone was truly liable. But don't make it too easy. It's not. Legally, the standards are tough to meet, and the criminal standards are even tougher.
I would actually disagree with Harvey respectfully on this one, and I'll tell you, I'll give my reasons why. First, the law does require them to have a standard and follow a standard in making assessment of internal controls, and there's a framework for doing that. J.P. Morgan, led by the audit committee and the audit committee chair, did do a study of what their process had been. And you'll probably be shocked by this, but their study came out and found no fault with their process or any
Correct,
problems,
yes.
okay, which would be Defense Exhibit A, okay? On the other hand, the OCC came out with a report that found tremendous problems, a lack of risk management at the board, a lack of risk management, and a very, very flawed process. Given the findings of an independent, somewhat independent OCC, in fact, it was stunning to see us come from the OCC, because usually the OCC would be signing on the audit committee exam report, saying
that
that's
tells
a
you
problem.
something,
To
yeah.
find the OCC come out with the report they did that was critical
Right.
was astounding. And to see that, and then see the SEC bring no action, does highlight just how far off the track their enforcement is.
Can I say something?
And I think that's my point, so thank you, that's what I was,
Yeah, but I think you have to distinguish, you say, where's the groundswell? I think there is among the public, among the citizenry, and you have to distinguish between that and then, being able to actually do something. And that's where you get to what Lynn was talking about. You had the guy who was the chief counsel at JP Morgan, who was the head of enforcement at the SEC, and where he said the current SEC would not bring any action. So there you have it again, that this control of the system over the very, laws that would put them, in a position where they would face some consequences. So it's the system controls the government, basically. And he's able to get away with it. Jamie Dimon's able to get away with it. If you did it, you certainly wouldn't get away with it. They'd throw you in jail and lock, throw the key away.
but I think that's my point, that we all understand that. And the thing that I'm hoping to try to get a discussion going on about is...
How can it change?
How can it change, and how can we, there's something that on the surface looks very clear. He certainly violated the internal
Yeah.
control requirements, right? So perhaps it would be very difficult to make that case. But the jury's still out on that. We're still waiting for we're still waiting for the Senate investigation. So this isn't over yet. And Jamie Dimon is, somebody may be willing to throw him under the bus. So, do we have to wait until that, the internal politics get so nasty for Jamie before we can even pray that
Yes.
a law, yes,
We do.
of course.
Yeah.
So in the meantime, I'm hoping to be prepared to jump on that, to be driving that bus when they're ready to throw him
So-
under it.
Me
So-
too. I'm right there with
With my former litigation and enforcement hats on, if you were getting ready to bring this case, this wouldn't be the case you'd bring first. What you have, back to the fraud recipe, you see not slightly bad, you see immensely bad loans,
Yes.
right, as an absolute routine. After warnings that liar's loans are 90% fraudulent, right? You see massive increases in these loans. And the only way to do that is to completely suborn your internal controls.
Right.
And then you get Sarbanes-Oxley statements routinely saying the internal controls are fabulous.
Right.
When you have to suborn those controls, you always, in a larger organization, get pushback, simply because it is a large organization. So there are some people who are whistleblower types, there are some people who simply, they're professional, and there are others that are just kind of stodgy, and they don't get the message. And those people always have to be attacked by the management.
Right.
So we have those cases in abundance at literally hundreds of lenders. You have not seen those cases brought. That would be superb cases. So if I'm doing a litigation, and this is how also you build public support. When we brought those 1,000+ convictions, we also brought over 3,000 enforcement actions and roughly 800 civil suits. You get a press report when you file, you get a press report when they're arrested, you get a press report when the trial begins, when something juicy happens at the trial, when they're convicted, when they're sentenced, and sometimes when they go to prison. And you get that nationally, and you get it in the regional press.
Right.
And after you do we did 3,000 enforcement actions, so literally 5,000 times, the public goes, oh my God, there's a pattern here, right? So we knew we had won when Annunzio, who was terrible, just an absolute friend of the frauds, started wearing a button that was literally 6 inches in diameter that said, jail the SNL crooks. Now, it's completely disingenuous, but you know that you've finally changed the politics. So that's how you create the movement. You don't start with this diamond case, right? You start by picking off these people that are absolutely plain, and you develop good precedential language. And to do this, you have to litigate at least some cases, right? And that's one of the terrible things. That's what Elizabeth Warren was asking about. Yes, we're going to settle the great bulk of cases, but you got to bring some to establish precedent. And then his good, incredibly good lawyer with all the wonderful connections to the SEC starts getting very worried, and he actually starts coming in to negotiate a deal that says, Jamie's really interested in leaving.
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
Historically, I've got to jump in on the SEC. Historically, the SEC has had good periods and bad periods. And that's true of almost any agency. Luckily, the SEC has had crown jewel-like highs when Lynn was around, and not such high periods. You put the period 2005 through 9. But I don't think, certainly in the present SEC, Jamie Dimon is safe because Steve Cutler knows people in enforcement. For most lawyers in enforcement today, and it's true during any good period, getting a scalp of somebody like Dimon would be worth its weight in gold. And ambitious, and in terms of ambitions, that would be there. But you've got to develop the case that Bill was talking about, and you've got to develop over time. And for these modern cases, the 2007, 8, 9 cases, what you're going to need is a mafia-like approach of turning people. And that's where they are now, trying to move and turn people, because otherwise the CEO is going to be in position to say, my accountants say it's okay, Lynn to the contrary. My lawyers told me it was okay. I couldn't have known about that. It's a very hard case without developing witnesses, taking time. None of this is necessarily over, by the way. The Chase, JP Morgan stuff, all was, last few years, no statute of limitations is run.
But it's 5 years for the most part on the rest of the stuff, so
The other stuff, and that's why when they went after S&P, they had to use the bank statute so they could get a 10-year statute. For most of it, the 5 years have run. For the JP Morgan, the 5 years have not run.
Well, what is troubling, though, is Harvey's right about when you bring an enforcement case, you like to be able to turn people at the lower level, and you start the depots and the subpoenas with people at the lower level. But what is most troubling in this go-around is we've had a number of people who have come forward with whistleblowers with evidence and all, and DOJ has never contacted them.
Right.
And Harvey and I saw some of that when we were there. There was a case in a company that was a fraud by the name of Sunbeam with Al Chainsaw Dunlap. And we, at the SEC, we pleaded, Harvey knows this very well, we tried to get the DOJ to take up the case. In the end, the DOJ, which was, U.S. Attorney was in Miami in that case, wouldn't even pick up the phone and call the attorney for Dunlap. So you've got some people in some of these U.S. attorney positions that are not very good. Just 2 weeks ago, I was in San Diego. Preet Bahara did a presentation. He was asked the question, why hasn't he done any of the prosecutions? He gave an answer very close to what Harvey said, I think. Harvey was a good summary. But he also mentioned and used an example of a company where the attorneys told the CEO he didn't need to disclose big losses that he was aware of. Depositions of his own deposition showed that he was aware of the losses. His attorney came in and said, even though they're material, they're not out there publicly, you don't have to disclose them, and he just rested on that. Unfortunately, that case is B of A and Ken Lewis. And the attorney representing Ken Lewis in the B of A case is Mary Jo White, who is the former head of Preet Bharara. People will be.
And God help us.
But again,
Seems
because
to
Mary
be
Jo
out of-
White was one of my first students, so I have a certain affection. She graduated from Columbia Law School in 1974. She was first in her class. She was a tough, driven person as a U.S. attorney, and as smart as can be. Yes, she did represent Ken Lewis, and she'd obviously have to recuse herself on anything coming up. But Mary Jo is one potentially very good SEC chairman. I'd be willing to bet on her doing well.
So the cases here are actually much stronger than in the savings and loan era, right? So I think this is the opposite of Harvey's inclination. And they're much stronger here because you have so many of the people who did exactly the right thing. And they make superb witnesses as opposed to somebody who has to be turned and has to confess that they knowingly facilitated a fraud. Instead, you get someone who said, no, I knowingly resisted the fraud and they fired me for it, right? That's wonderful. And you have the small little matter that the loans were called liar's loans, right? That's difficult for an executive to start explaining why massively fraudulent loans that we've known for over 100 years are going to prove fatal to the lender. And I'll disagree a little bit with Lynn. One of the points of the paper is confirming what we've said for a very long time. There was skin in the game. Almost always there were reps and warranties by the sellers of these mortgages that produce skin in the game. And back to my allied point, that has meant the creation of an enormous record that proves that the sellers knew how bad the packages were, right? Because A, their internal folks told them, but second, this group, and this group is ridiculous, Clayton. I mean, first, the best credit underwriters in the world decide they won't underwrite credit, even though their firm's survival and reputation depends upon it. And they go out and hire Clayton instead. Now, does that make any sense? No, it doesn't make any sense at all. Then they instruct Clayton to do a crappy job. And everybody who reads it on how they were instructed knows they were assigned to do a crappy job. And despite the fact that they were assigned to do a crappy job, and look at a tiny little sample, they always document a disaster. I mean, not just a little disaster, a catastrophic disaster, in which 44% of the reps and warranties were false, according to Clayton. 44%, right? And so this all gets documented and it goes to both the buyer and the seller. This is a kind of record we never had in the savings and loan to be able to use on collapse. This is not a problem with your internal controls. This is a complete collapse. These are, you have one standard, you set it out, you claim that you met the standard, and we know definitively that you didn't come anywhere close to meeting the standard, and that you then lied about it to sell the product. So we have great cases, and I don't think any of them have been brought. Do you know of a single one that's been brought by the SEC or DOJ?
No, and in fact, what comes to mind there is in private litigation, the case against the executives and part of the case against the audit firm at Lehman, the court has allowed to move forward. Notwithstanding that, notwithstanding the record in the private litigation, the SEC came out and said, we'll not bring any case against Lehman and its executives, which is when you've got a judge who has seen that evidence and said there's enough here to proceed, and yet the SEC is saying we're not going to do anything. It just, again, shows you can't depend upon the agency for enforcement. They did bring a case against the CEO at Countrywide, Mazzella. I was asked to testify in that case against the SEC on behalf of the CFO. I looked at the evidence, and the evidence was very good for the SEC. I thought, in fact, I thought the SEC even had a better case than what they did bring, because Mazzella had actually gone out and had identified that there were problems in the industry, problems with loans. He actually comes back, talks to his COO, CFO, and the whole crew about the whole thing. His internal audit group then finds problems with the loans, and they do nothing about it. So the guy has knowledge about it. He's taken certain actions with respect. So the SEC settles with him and settles for $30 million. The problem is not a single dime of the $30 million was paid for by Mazzella. You talk about getting someone's name. Every last dime of that settlement was paid out of an insurance policy that was outstanding at Countrywide, by then a part of B of A. So Mazzella never paid a single dime.
Plus, he walked away with over $100 million.
Plus, there's another angle on
Well,
that.
better get someone else over here.
I wanted to ask about whether you believe these frauds are symptomatic of financial cycles or drivers of financial cycles, and if so, what role the Federal Reserve and other central banks have in monetary policy and how that can, and of course, their regulators as well.
Sure. So in the savings and loan crisis, the National Commission to investigate the causes found after its studies that at the typical large failure, fraud was invariably present. So it was a definite driver of the second phase of the savings and loan debacle. The first phase was Volcker raising interest rates in an industry that was grotesquely exposed to interest rate risk. The first one turned out, we were lucky, rates went back down, and the National Commission said 25 billion roughly, the total 150 billion losses were due to the interest rate changes. But much of the remainder was due to the fraud. In the Enron era, that's fraud driving, of course, those crises. But if you're asking about the bubble in high tech, that's far, there aren't great studies trying to say to what extent, if any, did fraud contribute to the creation of that bubble. In terms of the current crisis, the evidence on the liar's loans is, when they've been looked at, 90% of them involve fraud. By 2006, according to Credit Suisse, 40% of total mortgage loans originated that year were liar's loans. Half of the loans called subprime are also liar's loans. These are not mutually exclusive categories. So these were the marginal loan that drove the hyperinflation of the bubble. They increased roughly 500% between 2003 and the end of 2006. So they, graphically, they look like a stairway to heaven, except it's to hell. And so there's, they are a major contributor, and they are not the only forms of fraud. We've talked about Tomas's study about some other areas, and there are many other areas of fraud. We have not discussed appraisal fraud, which is really one of the largest single areas of fraud and most pernicious. So this is where you go to the borrower, and the borrower says, I don't know whether I can make the payments. And you say, why are you focusing on the payments? The appraisal came in at $380. You bought it for $330. What a brilliant move you made in getting this house at a huge bargain. Lock it in. If things go badly, you got a $50,000 profit. So that's one of the most pernicious forms of fraud. And appraisal fraud almost invariably comes from the lender side. Lender and its agents, the brokers. There's a big discussion there's a real division among economists in micro versus macro. So if you're a macro guy or gal, you're almost always going to focus on quote-unquote imbalances. And this is the standard IMF interpretation of the crisis. If you're a micro person, I'm a micro person, as you may have guessed, you say, well, that's real nice, but whether interest rates are high or low, or you have exports or not have exports, you still need these fraud mechanisms to drive the crisis. And in high interest and low interest environments, you can get bubbles. So, you know, we tend to not say that the macro was not critical or decisive. I think it is true that you can kill a bubble by causing a recession, but it's kind of a crude device.
I can add 2 cents on that. The Fed can be faulted, I think, in the period, you know, talking about going up to the financial crisis of 2007, 8, 9, on 2 levels. One is monetary policy. The second, but I'm a law professor, I don't want to do monetary policy. But the second is the Fed was the regulator of the mortgage industry in many ways, with broad authority to put real limits on what was going on. Let me give you an imperfect comparison. SEC overlooking broker-dealers. Broker-dealers are not exactly perfect animals out there, but they have to be educated, they have FINRA tests, they have all kinds of suitability rules. And the SEC and FINRA, which has a budget of roughly $900 million, were overseeing those broker-dealers and held things to some real degree in check. In the mortgage broker world, there was nothing out there. The Fed had authority to oversee, to regulate. They did nothing. Now, can it be surprising that a mortgage broker for Countrywide or wherever else was going to commit fraud? In Bill's terms, I think it's perfectly accurate. Was going to up appraisals, was going to up incomes, was not going to look at employment history. They wanted to go ahead and get the deal. Now, if you're Greenspan at the Fed, with people like Ned Gramlich on the board saying, you know, I'm worried about the way this is heating up, you would have said, and I'm sure Greenspan said it, and I have real regard for him with all the problems, but don't worry, people don't make loans for mortgages, the banks and Countrywide, unless they think they're going to be paid. That can't be their economic model. What Alan Greenspan didn't understand was that everything was being passed on in that sense. They were being converted into CDOs and built around with a credit default swap, and they were being given high ratings by the credit agencies, which, by the way, were being paid enormously more for evaluating a CDO than they were for anything they were doing with public companies. And all of that, with no oversight, had to add up to the mess that we found. Now, that's the failure of a regulatory scheme and the failures of deregulation and a kind of naive belief that markets will be self-correcting somehow. And so the Fed gets a meaningful amount of the blame, in my mind, for what went wrong.
Just give the specific, the Fed and only the Fed had unique authority under the Home Ownership and Equity Protection Act of 1994 to regulate any lender, mortgage lender. And it finally used that authority on July 14th, 2008 to end liar's loans, a year after the markets ended them. And even then, it delayed the effective date of the rule for 15 months because you wouldn't want to inconvenience a fraudulent lender.
Question over here?
Yeah, well, there's been one lawsuit that has been brought by a financial bulldog, and that's by Hank Greenberg of AIG, saying he was robbed by these crooks, and it was all Frank Zarb's fault that all took it over. And I'm sure you have some commentary on that.
Oh, I do.
Go ahead.
But for full transparency here, when that happened, when Zarb and the board, it wasn't just Frank Zarb, it was his board as a whole, revolted against Hank Greenberg. Spitzer was doing his investigation, Greenberg came to the full board and said he was not going to cooperate. And at that point in time, the directors on that board as a whole decided that it was tremendous exposure to AIG not to cooperate. And so the board took the action to remove Greenberg. And I think the only member of the board that actually supported Greenberg staying was Carla Hills, the former, I think she was Commerce Committee. And there were some very conflicted transactions between Greenberg and other officers, including the subsequent officer, Marty Sullivan, with an off-the-balance sheet entity called CV Star. So from my perspective, and at the time, I was running a proxy research firm. Harvey knows this because I got a call from him on it, in which we voted against Frank Zarb. We didn't think Zarb was a good pick on the board. But the move to remove Greenberg, I think, was a very good move, and I think Greenberg is absolutely way out of line on that particular deal, given what he did, and for him to come back then and sue for the government taking over is, I think, even more outrageous, because if the government hadn't stepped in 2008, when you looked at that $60 billion portfolio, that company would be the largest insurance company in the world, a very important company, would be no more. And there were pieces of the business that were very good. The insurance business was very good. It was the consumer products group where they'd done these restructurings that was the bad egg. So the government did right. Greenberg could have prevented his problem just by cooperating, and he decided he was, bigger than anyone, and he paid a price, and he deserved to pay the price.
Have time for at least one more. Rowan's the real boss. One more? Okay, two more. Go ahead. Here and here.
Right. Excuse me. I'm wondering, is there not enough public outrage to get prosecutions and exposure, or is there not enough will to get exposure and prosecutions to create that public outrage? Because I think I've heard both, and I'm really wondering, is anything going to happen anymore at all after especially the HSBC settlement in December, which is really the non plus ultra of settlements where they admitted that the bank laundered billions of dollars for the Mexican and Colombian drug cartels and for so-called terrorists, and we're having a war on drugs and a war on terrorism, and they only pay an institutional penalty, and if they sold marijuana out of a public housing project, everyone would have been arrested in the House, and the judge would sort out, the jury would sort out, the plea bargains would sort out who's guilty and who's not. So it's just incredible. And I'm wondering if you could comment on that case.
Well, I won't comment on the case as such, but I will comment in general that one message from this seminar is that individual liability really counts. Not only in terms of public perception, but in terms of creating the deterrence we need out there. There's nothing like a CEO suffering in prison or elsewhere when the wrongdoing is venal, to send a message to the society, this can't be done. And in truth, there's nothing like imprisonment for me. Civil penalties, money, whether the institution pays or the CEO pays, it's money. You cannot avoid the pain of prison. You can't pass it on. Even those so-called easy prisons for white-collar criminals are not easy. To have 24-hour oversight of what you do and years away from family creates real pain, and we need that pain, and we need the message it sends. So, as I say, one basic answer to all of this is we've got to find mechanisms for reaching more individuals. Now, Bill, I take it you'd agree on that.
Yeah, we invented the phrase too big to prosecute, to ridicule it, and then they adopted it officially. So we've decided to stop inventing phrases lest they go even further. Yeah, it is beyond scandalous, and we now know that Lanny Brewer stayed up all night worrying about the consequences of bringing criminals to jail, but not about the $20 trillion and 20 million job loss that Lynn was talking about. That didn't cause him to stay up, apparently, at all. Unless you get rid of the current crew, there is absolutely no chance. Holder is
crew
terrible.
Comes in the same exact thing.
There have been crews.
He's talking about cases where they had very, very strong cases, and they wouldn't bring the case. It's corrupt. The system's corrupt. The people see that. It's very obvious. I'm not sanguine at all that we're going to see any change in it whatsoever. And they control the system. They control even law enforcement. Look at what happened with Occupy Wall Street. And those people were out there demonstrating, exercising their constitutional right. They had their heads split open, tear gassed, everything else. I mean, and these guys could do whatever they want with impunity. I don't see it changing. What's going to change it? The money from Wall Street and these, big corporations is what controls politics, and it's what keeps them out of trouble. I think that's what's going on right now.
I think you, sir, had your hand up first.
Let me see, how could I put this? Well, the laws are basically created by a few people with a little reason, a lot of self-interest. I mean, fraud, like secrecy, is created out of complexity. Corporations, corp, the Latin, it's an oxymoron, it's a non-body. There is no accountability, there's duopoly, monopoly, driven by personality. So why don't we license the people through a psychological process to remove the master manipulators and narcissistic psychopaths from the system? Okay? Because there's nothing better than a good coat hanger, but you put a nut in it and he'll go running rampant and wreck the place. Okay? And the other thing is that, white collar, blue collar, the reason why they call people blue collar is because you couldn't wear white shirts in a factory and get your shirt dirty. So that's the same reason you don't say, you say white collar is fraud and blue collar is theft. Apples and oranges, everything's a fruit. I mean, license these people. They're not actually intellectuals. They're master manipulators and they're narcissistic psychopaths. Now, I'm going to be running for city council next year, all right? And I don't care if I get in or out, but if I do get in, I'm going to cause a problem.
So quite a good book, which had terrible timing because it came out in 2008, on moral markets, which was intended to be a celebration of the markets and how they made us more moral. But it does contain the phrase that Homo economicus is a sociopath. And you want to know the really bad things? There's quite an active literature in business schools and from top business school academics, including Stanford, defending narcissism by CEOs as an ideal trait.
It's Ayn Rand.
Well, I don't know. Ayn Rand said that the government should stop fraud. She actually expressly said that.
Vanity is good, to brush your teeth and comb your hair and keep yourself clean. It doesn't work in a boardroom,
I was not defending that research. I was telling you that whatever is gets defended.
Okay, at the back, and then this lady here, and then it's got it.
First of all, Mr. Greenspan, there was a hedge fund that failed in 1998, and he said if we didn't bail it out, the entire economy would go. But after he did that, he did not change his policies one iota. But the question I have is, you've all made really brilliant cases, and I really appreciate them. But are we at the point where we have a system that, from the onset, with Hamilton's bailout of the the bond speculators, to right up until today, there has been constant fraud and collapses like we have today. Is it possible for us to talk about a different system? I don't know what it is, but a post-capitalist system that will not just value profits at the expense of humans and the environment. On top of a financial collapse, we've had a political coup d'etat. And we have a situation where we have endless wars for oil, where we should be investing half of our budget, which is the military, in renewable sources, in education. We have a system that is totally broken. Is that part of the conversation for finance?
And
in a way, that question and the question before run to our overall government, and our government has had, as Harvey mentioned, good years and bad years. But at the end of the day, our government is based upon a majority vote. And the majority of the people in this country do have the chance every 4 years to make a change in that government. The majority of the people in this country have expressed their view and elected the people they chose back to Washington. In this case, it also includes people like Senator Schumer, who has been very good on some issues, and at other times has been one of the staunchest defenders of Wall Street. He was one of the biggest takers of money from Enron, and yet in this state, you have returned him time and time again. If the people decide they don't like those people back there, then a majority can vote them out. But what we have turned around and seen in this country is people return the same people, give them a 10% approval rating, bitch and moan about them, and then turn around and re-elect them. From that perspective, I think the systemic problem runs to the people who go and vote the poll or vote those people back in. And until people in this country start turning around and doing some of their own homework and quit re-electing the same damn people time and time again, you're going to have the same result. And you should expect no different result.
Well, that's why we occupy
The
Wall
Tea
Street.
Party was a completely different group of people, and they were a disaster. You know, we elected different people. I mean, I think it has to do with just a destructive, look, this is easy to fix, very easy to fix. We know what we need in this country to create like a utopian kind of society. I mean, you need infrastructure, you need education, you need health care, you need energy, you need transportation, you need all these things. The government has the power to issue the money to get all these things done. But what we do is cede that power over to the financial sector, where it's basically private credit, all right? And that's another driving force that leads to these bubbles. And we don't do what we have to do because, again, we get into this whole discussion of labels. We can't do that. That's socialism, that's communism, that's not right. We need to have free enterprise, the private sector. So having this belief system keeps us from doing the things we need to do. Look, we have unbelievable abundance in this country, like I said before, but we look at it as if we have lack. And the way it's set up, if you want to know, our monetary system is upside down. The high-powered money, the money that the government issued, you think of a pyramid upside down, that little tiny point, the apex is at the bottom. That's the smallest amount, the smallest size, right? That's the high-powered money, the government that the money that the government spends into the economy. The rest of that pyramid, the big portion of that pyramid, is credit money, private credit money. And we've seen it all throughout history, the 19th century, these kind of bubbles and busts and panics. Why? Because it was structured exactly like that. There were 10,000 different currencies in the 19th century. And nobody knew what it was worth, and you'd get some, and the bank would be out of business the next day, and people's entire savings were blown out. that monetary system, in my opinion, needs to be turned the other way around. The big portion has to be state money issued by the government. How to go for the things we need: healthcare, education, infrastructure, basic research and development, science, all these things. And we can do it, but we don't do it because we say, oh, that's printing money. Look, it's all printing money. We went off the gold standard. There's nothing precluding us from doing what we need to do today, right now, and turning the economy around and having a situation where everyone's employed, and they, by the way, then they're making enough income to pay for their loans and their mortgages, and you don't have to do derivatives on top of derivatives on top of derivatives to create some new money instrument, because there's not enough of that high-powered money in the economy. It can absolutely be done. I can do it in 10 minutes, but nobody's going to elect me to do it. And even if they did, you have to deal with an idiot assembly, a Congress, that won't allow it to get done. But so that's the frustration, all right? That's the frustration. We have in our hands the ability to turn it around exactly as you said, to create the kind of society that we all want, where we don't have these crazy things going on. But it's a destructive belief system that keeps us from doing it, and it's a bunch of criminal elements that are in control of that, not just the government, law enforcement, everything else, and that precludes us from doing the right thing.
Last comment or question here, and then Rowan gets the last word.
Thank you so much. Really interesting. I'm new to this idea of control fraud, and I just want to throw out something. I'm a mathematician by training. I worked with Larry Summers at a hedge fund during the credit crisis, got disgusted with that, and applied to the SEC because I wanted to fix the problem. I was a futures quant and the CFTC. They didn't want me. I worked in risk instead for 2 years. I got disgusted by the way the risk models were being abused, and that the mathematics was being sort of fronted as a solution, as a sort of rubber stamp for real risk. The too big to fail banks did not care about the answer. Sorry for the long thing, but I'm trying to make a point. I just got an offer from the SEC Enforcement Division now. I asked the person who's offering me the job, aren't the statute of limitations for the real problems over? And she said, oh, I don't know. My feeling is that the difference between the historical problems and now is that there's a new kind of control fraud, if you will, and that is sort of mathematics itself. If control fraud is like taking what is legitimate and whoring it for the sake of fraud, for the sake of profit, I feel like that is being done to mathematics. I talk to mathematicians about this. I want to see if you agree, first of all, and how to address it. I think it's wrapped up in the fact of the complexity. It's wrapped up in the idea of innovations and stuff like that. But just to hear your comments. Thank you.
Let me urge you to take the job at the SEC. They really do need the help. And one of the fascinating things happening, I mean, the SEC is being starved in terms of budget. Its budget is about $1.3 billion, and in Washington, in the real world, it's wholly inadequate. But they are moving into technology, into math, into computers, into new programs. A lawyer's agency, which was too much, is now changing to one that can begin to handle the modern economy. I say begin to handle because I don't want to understate or overstate what can be done on the SEC's budget. Their budget is roughly $100 million for technology, and it's being cut back all the time. And they've been cutting back on technology. The average firm on Wall Street, broadly defined for the country, is spending billions upon billions on information technology. The fact we're not doing it is a national travesty and foolishness. But getting good people in Washington, don't turn down the job.
Okay, I'm going to give you a fairly mathematical answer. At least math theory answer. So I apologize in advance to the general audience. Math is one of the largest problems that we have in terms of facilitating these frauds. The fundamental premise is that there is an exogenous distribution of risk, and there isn't. That's the whole concept of a criminogenic environment. that by creating really perverse incentives, we create the distribution, right? And that means any modeling techniques that assume an exogenous set will give you disastrously bad results. And they'll be easily manipulable by those who get their bonuses by understating risk. In the financial world, when you understate risk, you overstate asset valuation. When you overstate asset valuation, you get paid a ton of money. So this is a superb problem, and it's being, in our view, addressed in an absurd fashion with this discussion of fat tails and black swans, as if the problem were that we simply misspecified the distribution slightly. That's completely false. And indeed, I think that one I could get agreement with on anybody that's conversant with statistics. And so having someone like you that would understand that in the SEC to head them off, because otherwise they'll simply go with these models and they'll talk with each other in the industry trade, and they'll be completely lost. They'll be completely conned, and they'll use these models as if they were real, and they're not. Indeed, I would say the recent Italian election, right? This is what we have finally needed. Someone to actually go, when the credit rating agencies said that stuff that was literally in my era referred to as toxic waste had somehow become AAA. People needed to laugh in their faces, and they needed to be driven out of any respectable society, right? That was not just a lie. It was a preposterous, on its face lie that anyone that knew anything about real estate instruments, anything about mathematics, knew had to be a lie. But the more the SEC people were trained in econometric and statistical techniques, the more susceptible they were to that lie instead of the other way around. It was the examiners, the old-time examiners, who said, this is bullshit. It was the new Sharpies that said, ooh, great, and they had wonderful intellectual discussions. And I will tell you exactly how the con works in the real world if you do take the job at the SEC. You go and you talk with one of the gurus on Wall Street, and it'll be a he, will say something that is untrue. And as soon as you nod, he knows he has you.
I'm not a nodder.
I understand. This is not personal to you.
I'm just saying that,
This is not personal to you.
I understand.
This is what happens when we train people and send them out who believe in the distribution. And they're pretty good, but they're not at this level, and more to the point, they're not familiar with people who actually lie to them. Fellow math types who actually lie to them.
Right.
And as soon as they make that lie and you nod, they know that the game is over and they have you. So it's not personal to you. It's, again, more to the point, get into the SEC and protect us against those quants who are currently employed at the SEC and the Fed, because they are the greatest danger. And for example, the idea that you can look at systemic risk through quant techniques is absolutely falsified by all human history. The people that have done vastly better on real systemic risk have been the field examiners in every single case. So, great. Do take the job and protect us against your counterparts.
Yeah, I'll be very quick. First of all, I just want to thank everybody for taking their time, and it was really great to hear your different perspectives. So, and just two very quick things. one quick plug, and that is that we're going to have a tutorial to accompany this. We'll be just talking about the ideas raised here and some of the readings. So if you're interested, that's on Saturday. It's online at 1 p.m. You can access via the website, and I hope you'll consider coming there and continuing the conversation. I just had one quick clarification, then a question to everybody to close up. And the clarification is, you mentioned a judge who openly saw evidence of fraud and chose to do nothing. I was wondering if you'd be willing to name any names there or just talk about the case, Mr. Turner. And then I thought you mentioned at one point a judge. Anyway, I'm just going from one of the questions online. Anyway, maybe not.
I think Lynn may have mentioned, but...
Yeah, I was wondering if you could... Maybe you don't remember. The other question is just more generally talking about the ideas that Professor Black was saying, that in the 90s people had these kind of ideas and had certain practices in some of the regulatory bodies. I was just curious if you think that the trend away from that has happened at a different speed under different regimes, and the extent to which you think the electoral cycle, speeds up or slows down or counteracts this process at all. I think one of the things that's come out of this seminar is that there are a lot of issues that are kind of more broadly related to the macro structure, or even just sort of the essence of politics, and where the pressure comes for change there. So I'm just curious if you think either party or any part of the process is more prone to pressure and leverage.
One of the things we haven't focused on that has been immensely destructive has been the regulatory competition and laxity. And I know Brooksley Bourne, at a conference that I was at recently, said that it really kicked off in major degree when the FSA was created in the City of London. The FSA came over to U.S. conferences and openly trolled for folks to relocate to the City of London on the promise of reg light.
Anyone else? Professor Goldschmidt, Turner, do you have any other things to add to that?
Well, I think Bill's answer is basically right, if I understood it. You go through periods in terms of activity and other things. The deregulatory period we've had, in part, was FSA talking about light regulation, but the atmosphere in Washington. Don't forget, in the year 2000, and this was Brooksley Bourne's, the end of the tragic way she was handled, we deregulated all derivatives. Nobody could look at derivatives in government. We're getting much better. Sarbanes-Oxley, for me, and we don't have time, was a very strong act on the whole and did very much to help reform the accounting profession. Dodd-Frank, we've only seen about half of it put into effect yet, and we don't know. What worries me about Dodd-Frank is some of the structure and the fact that the assumption is we'll be able to regulate these massive institutions. And I'm worried about that. I don't have an answer on it, but I am worried about that. Lynn, you want?
Yeah, on the judge thing, let me clarify. The judge in the private litigation from shareholders against the executives at Lehman, the judge has let the case go forward.
Oh, okay.
The judge did not agree to the summary motion to dismiss the case. So the case has gone forward against the executives, and part of the case against the auditors, Ernst & Young. Part of the case was dismissed, but part was allowed to go forward. It was the SEC who then decided not to bring any case. So that's where the problem rested in that case. It was the SEC did nothing, and of course the Valukas report was extremely critical of the SEC's oversight of Lehman.
My congressional testimony is far broader than the Valukas report on the frauds by Lehman Brothers as well, and you can actually watch a video of them trying to gavel me down for 2.5 minutes, and then watch them never ask a single question about fraud.
Thank you.
On that note, thank you all for coming. Thank you.
Thank you.